Data is not this ambiguous, amorphous concept on the web. It is highly structured and logically represented so we can work with it in a consistent way. And this idea of like representing data so we can easily work with it is what data modeling is all about. And what we're trying to do with data modeling is describe and present our data in such a way that it's easy for us to work with and we can understand everything we need to know about this entity or this model or record that we're working with. So let's take a look at a quick menu here and kind of see this in action. So we've got the create a menu page. And as we can see the menu properties. And funny enough, as designers, we actually do a lot of data mapping and modeling. We just don't necessarily know it or call it that. So in looking at this design, you might be thinking to yourself, I just see some components. I see a title input, a description input, status, primary color, secondary color. That's pretty standard stuff. In reality, when a developer looks at this, what they're saying is data property, data property, data property, data property. These are all attributes of the menu itself. And so a really helpful way to think about this is in terms of nouns and attributes. So we have this noun here, right? The menu is the thing that we are creating or presenting in this interface. And then that menu has attributes, properties of itself that we need to be keeping track of and storing. So it has a title, it has a description, it has a status. Anytime you can say this thing has this property, we're talking about data modeling. And so we unwittingly didn't even realize it. We're actually creating the initial data model for our menus here when we started designing. And the more explicit we can be about this, the better our designs are going to be and the better collaboration we're going to have with our developers because they are data modeling all the time. We just don't probably realize it. So what can we do with this? We've got our menu settings up here. Why don't we go over to a spreadsheet and take a look at this in a little bit more detail. So we'll come over here and we can now, just using simple spreadsheet software, take a look at this in a little bit more detail. So what I like to do, that first row is going to be reserved for my data attributes. And these are the things we're going to use to describe the properties of our menu. So things like the title, really important. We're going to say description as well. We are going to say the status. And we had a primary color and a secondary color. Great. And we've, in doing this, modeled the data that we need for the menu. Now, it can be really helpful to think of two more considerations here. The first is what type of data are we trying to store here? And then the second thing is, can we get some examples of this data so that way we can sort of see it in action a little bit more? So the next thing I like to do on row 2 is define the type of data I expect this to be. So again, let's come back over here. And we're actually making a lot of data type decisions in here implicitly that we probably aren't even aware of. So let's start with the title. That is just a regular input. And notice how it's a lot smaller and shorter than the description. Well, when it comes to modeling data, we have to be really explicit about how long or how many characters a given data property has. So when it comes to the type of data here at the database level, we need to be really explicit about this is going to be a string or a collection of different characters kind of put together, and that's in programming languages what we call a string, essentially just text. But it's going to be shorter. There's not going to be a lot of text here. And maybe there's some validation logic here that we need to be explicit about or communicate to our developers and say, hey, titles should really only ever be 40 characters. That would be really important information that we want to explain to them. But in our case, we're just going to say, hey, this is just a string. And so we can come back over here now and we can say, this will be a string. And what that means is it's text. It is text information that we should be capturing here. Same thing with description. This is also going to be a string as well. Status is a little bit more interesting because it's going to be a string, right? We have draft and we have published right now, and we know that from our two examples over here. And maybe there's more. Maybe there's a under review or something like that. We can add as many of these things as we want. But really, there's a set list of these properties that we want to be keeping track of. So maybe we could use something like an enum, which is basically a fancy way of saying set values for our property here. So that could make sense. String is a little bit more flexible though. It doesn't give us the protections of an enum of saying like, okay, it has to be drafted, it has to be published, but it provides us more flexibility in the future if we ever want to change them and add that under review one or something like that. So in our case, why don't we say this is going to be a string as well? Great. Primary color, secondary color. What are we doing here? Are we storing colors on the back end? Probably not. That's not. There's not exactly a great way to do that. But what can we store? What's a good representation of color that we could then give to a front end and it would know exactly what we're talking about? Well, probably the hex value. So that is really the data that we want to be storing for those two attributes. It's not necessarily the color itself, it's the hex value of that color. And as we know, that little string of characters, it's just going to be a string because it's got letters and numbers inside there as well. So we're going to have a string. Very fun. So for all of these, we ended up with strings across the board. And that's going to be very, very common. String is sort of your most common data property. If we look through the design a little bit more, we've got section names. We've got names for every item. Price. Price is going to be a little bit different because it's a number. It's something numeric that we want to display. And if we look at our design over here, notice that we're using whole numbers for everything. That's a really important thing to call out to a developer because we can store things as whole numbers, integers as they're called, or we can have floating values or floats, which include decimal places. And so those are stored differently on the back end, and we need to be really explicit about how we're doing that. In fact, when it comes to number values, we actually never want to store them as like dollars with cents because that's a really good way to get math errors, which you don't know about until you're a developer. We really want to store all these as integer cent values to make sure that we're doing the math correctly. So it's not $8, it's 800 cents. If I did that math right for our Ensalada Caprese. So these are the little things that in talking to a developer, they're going to pick up on. And if we know about it, we can be really explicit to them like, hey, no, I've thought about this as well. And maybe we could store it this way. Of course, they're going to get the final say, but that's going to be much more proactive, a much better conversation. And now what we can do is we can say, okay, let's look at some values. And sometimes I like to add a space here. Sometimes I like to add a line or something like that. But what's the title of our menu? We could say, oh, Nick's Diner. That's the menu. A great place to eat. This will be published. This will be some sort of hex value. Why don't we just say something crazy to get us started here. And we'll do the same for the secondary color. Not a very exciting menu. But now, if we share this with our developers, we can say, hey, this is how we were thinking of modeling this information. So we have our properties, we have our types thought out, and we have some examples for you. What if we had Matt's Diner? And it's another good spot. But this is draft. And we can just go ahead and duplicate these down here. Great. It incremented, so we got a slightly different number. But now you can call out to your developer, hey, for status, right, we're going to have publish and we're going to have draft. So notice that these are two different values. And then descriptions can take different strings and things like that. So you can really have productive conversations when you just go through the simple exercise of trying to model the data. Now we've got other data here. We've got sections and items, and those are going to be actually related to the menu, but we might talk about that a little bit later. So just kind of see that idea of related. But if I was going to model them and I wanted to practice, I would go ahead and I would add a new sheet because those are new nouns technically. So a section would be here, and I will leave that as an exercise to you to go through that and just sort of model exactly how we would represent just this one property, and then you can go ahead and do the same thing for items as well. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions down in the comments.